Hello everybody, my name's Julia from Bobbins and Buttons, and today I'm going to show you three different methods for gathering fabric. I'm going to show you two methods using a regular sewing machine and one using an overlocker. So I'm going to show you all the methods on two different types of fabric so you can see the different effects that they give. So I'm going to use a really light, soft double gauze fabric, and I'm also going to use a much stiffer calico cotton fabric. So for this first method I'm going to show you gathering on a regular sewing machine, and this is the method that's probably used most commonly in sewing pattern instructions. So for this method you just need to make sure your machine is set up with a needle that's appropriate to the fabric that you're working on, and also lengthen the stitch length to the longest stitch length that it will go to. So in most cases that's 5. So I've turned my stitch length up to 5. And the other thing that I want to say, if you've got a machine that has an automatic cut facility, don't use that on gathering, because we need the long threads to be able to pull the gather stitches up. So make sure you don't use that. And also don't backstitch at the start or the finish of your seam line. So my top tip here for this method really is to either draw in your seam allowance or to use the grids on your sewing machine to be aware of where your seam allowance is, because once you've applied your frill or your gather to the part of garment you're attaching it to, you're probably going to want to remove any visible gather stitches. So it's much easier to remove those stitches if they're clear of the seam. So I like to make sure I've got one line of stitching above the seam allowance and one below, and then I can stitch through the middle when I actually apply it to the garment. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this, and I'll show you the next stage in a second. Like I said, don't back stitch at the start or finish of this seam. So there we have two rows of stitching on each fabric, and like I said, I've not locked the stitches at the end. And so now to gather them up, all we need to do is take the top two threads, and this is important. You can work on the back or you can work on the front, but decide which you're working on and stick to that, because once you've pulled one, if you go to the reverse and pull the other, you'll lock the stitches and it makes it much harder to work with. So I'm going to work with the top, and now I'm just going to gently pull and move the fabric along the channel like this, and you can see that starting to gather up. So that's the double gauze fabric. So let's have a look how it's going to work on the calico fabric. So exactly the same method, just gently pulling. Make sure you don't pull too tightly, because once you've snapped the thread you really need to pull it all out and do it again. So there you go, this is the calico. So depending on your pattern and what you're making, you might want a very gathered piece, or you might want to ease the gathers out and have less gathers. So you can just move the gathers along the stitching and ease them into the right place to make them how you want them to look. So that's a much shallower amount of gathering there, and you just need to kind of keep moving them along until they're nice and even. So now if this is stitched to the actual garment along the blue line, you can easily pull this line of stitching out once you've stitched that onto the garment. So this second method It's pretty much the same as the first method, but we're going to do an extra row of stitching. So rather than having 2 rows of stitching, we're going to have 3. So this is a good technique if you're struggling to get to even gathers, because you'll have a little bit more control over the gathers if you have more rows. So you could essentially even have more than 3 rows. But again, I'm going to stitch either side of the seam allowance, so I'm able to pull the gathers out afterwards once it's sewn to the garment. And the other thing, although often we think we need to turn the stitch length up to 5, you can get a little bit more control if you change the stitch length. So on a very light fabric you could go down to a smaller stitch length because it will still move fairly freely. So as a rule of thumb, I tend to use a smaller stitch, maybe a 3 to 3.5 on a very lightweight fabric, and then on a heavier weight fabric I'd go up to 5. But just to sort of demonstrate this, I'm going to change my stitch length down to 4 and do the 3 rows. I'm going to do 1 row above the seam allowance, and I'm going to do 2 rows below the seam allowance on a stitch length of 4. And other than that, it's going to be the same as I showed you. So we're going to make sure the threads are free and not backstitched at the start and the finish. So let me show you. So let's have a look at this now, gathering it. So again, we need to take the top threads only and just start to gather. And you can see even on a stitch length of 4, that gathers quite nicely. It's not slipping along quite so easily, which means I've got a little bit more control. So now when I come to stitch this, those are neatly put in place. And so if you have a problem with this flipping up and going into the seam, this also might help you with that. You make sure your gathers are all nice and in the right place. So let's have a look at this method on the double gauze, and I'm going to go down to a stitch length of 3 on the double gauze. So there we go. This is probably the smallest I'd go to for gathering stitch, and let's see how that gathers. This is a very lightweight fabric. And there you can see we're still getting nice gathers even at stitch length 3. So you can really play around and see what's going to work best for your fabric and for your project, because obviously frills and gathers can be used in all sorts of areas, but you can imagine that now stitched onto a skirt or a frill sleeve, and that's worked really nicely. So for this last method we're going to use the overlocker, and this is one of the main reasons why I wanted to show you the techniques on 2 different weights of fabric, because this one you will see a big difference. But it will work on both, and I'll show you how that works. So to start with, set your stitch length on the overlocker to as long as it will go, and also set your differential feed up to the highest, whether it's 2 or 2.5. So set those both up, and then we're just going to stitch along the edge. So we'll start with the double gauze. So on the double gauze, straight away you've already got a bit of gather happening because it's a lightweight fabric, and the differential feed and the stitch length has immediately made a bit of a gather. And if you're and different overlocking machines will give a different effect. And when I do this in one of my sewing classes where people bring their own overlocker, I have found that the Genome generally do a really great gather straight away on lightweight fabrics. But on the calico fabric, it's pulled it in slightly, but it's nothing that you would consider being a gather at this stage. But what you can do with this method, and like I said, it will work a lot better on the lighter weight fabrics, is just to take a pin and pull the needle threads, which can be a little bit fiddly. And once you've got the needle threads loose, you might have to cut a little piece off. You can start to pull the needle thread like you would with a gather thread and make more gathers. I mean, obviously with this, your stitching is all on the edge. You haven't got that flat piece with the extra lines of stitching that you have on the other methods. But this, I think this works really well, especially if you're just doing a gentle gather on something. So that's how that looks to start with on the double gauze, and also if you pull it up at the end. And then likewise we'll do the same here with the calico, which hasn't really gathered at all at the moment. As soon as you grab those two needle threads, you can use the same kind of technique as for the other methods and just pull the gathers along. Like I said, I think this really works better for the lighter weight fabrics, and the lighter it is, often it'll gather without needing any extra pulling of the threads. But there you can still get a nice gather. So there we go. I hope you found that useful. Please feel free to ask any questions in the comments below, and if you'd like to see more tutorials and videos, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.